In this section we want to talk about IP management, how it works, what it is, and also when to have IP in mind. And then we also talk about contracts. Managing intellectual property consists of 4 pillars and is done by the Technology Transfer Office. One task is, for example, to create opportunity. It must be an awareness creation that is important for the organization to create intellectual property. This can be done, for example, with meetings or special events, with prizes maybe for the best ideas. Or you could also do technology scouting. This means like the people working in the Technology Transfer Office search for the technology in the organization. Here it is also important that the Technology Transfer Office gives good information about IP protection to all the developers and researchers. And also part of this is that the commercialization succeeds of a technology. Inventors are also rewarded financially. They receive a share in these revenues, and that's also part of this creating opportunities here. Then if you've found some interesting technology, the next step is the evaluation. There in IP meetings, you review the most promising technologies, and there you have to decide which one is really important and needs good IP protection. And the next step is the IP protection. There for all the really important technologies, it's important to find the right way of protection. This can be a patent or a utility model or also a design or a trademark. That depends on the technology here. In the last step, it's the exploitation process. After you've protected your technology, it's important to use business strategies or also use license agreements or create spin-outs of these technologies, to make some money out of them. And with your IP protection, you have the chance to create a competitive advantage here for at least a certain time. And if you made money with this, for example, interesting for universities, then those can use their money again to improve the IP management and to give it back to the people working at this organization. Normally there are some rules and guidelines or recommendations for good IP management, and those are, for example, confidentially. That means your work should be kept confidential. You should sign non-disclosure agreements if you work together with other people. Then you also have to capture your work, also in lab notebooks and in invention disclosures. There should be intellectual property rights, like patent, design, copyrights. It depends on the technology what is the most important. If you collaborate with others, there must be some contracts, and there should be some IP provisions as well included, so that everything is clear who owns the intellectual property. And all in all these rules and recommendations, they should be written down in universities or big companies, so every researcher and every developer can see what he has to do and how to do it in a good way. So let's talk about some best practices when to have IP in mind. For example, it is really important in a development process, because there you have a lot of new things that are developed and those must be protected. There you have to record your daily work. There should be FTO analysis done, then also due diligence, and make sure that you draft your patent before you disclose it to the public. Also important to monitor your competitors. There you should have an overview of the patents in the market because of patent infringement, or if you need to do an objection against another patent. Really important, you should also have contracts in mind, and this is especially important when you collaborate with others. There you should think of non-disclosure agreements and also R&D agreements. If you transfer your technology to others, this might be licensing, selling or buying IP. So let's have a look at those steps in more detail. For example, the development stage. Here it is important to do a freedom to operate analysis and due diligence, so that you can be sure that you're not infringing any IP. Here you have to capture your daily work, and you need to have in mind that there's no more patent protection after you have disclosed your technology to the public. Here it is really important that this is a really critical stage in the creation of any IP, and so it's really important to have this here in mind. What exactly is a freedom to operate analysis? This means in general that you check whether your products and technologies are free from infringement. This should be done during and before the development starts. Why should you do it? Because it can avoid costs and risks before going to the market. And it's normally done by searching for patent documents. This can be done, for example, at ISPASnet. Yeah, the next crucial step was monitoring your competitors. Yeah, what is a good practice here? And you should actually constantly monitor their IP. There's some special software available that can do it for you, and all the product managers should be informed about those patents, and then they should decide if there needs to be an objection. There you have 9 months after the grant of a patent for objection, and this is quite an easy way to get rid of a patent from a competitor. If you miss this period, it can be really expensive. Yeah, then you have less risks or lower risks of patent infringement when you watch your competitors. Now let's talk about technology transfer and collaboration. What should be done here? There you should sign always non-disclosure agreements. Then there's also the point of licensing, and you should also have in mind that you can buy or sell your IP like other property. So what is a non-disclosure agreement? A legally binding contract in which one party agrees to disclose confidential information to another party, and the latter agrees not to disclose this information under the conditions set by the NDA. So you can talk, for example, about prototypes, and then it is clear it's not available to the public. This should be done before every R&D project, and also when you discuss with other people about innovative ideas, products or technologies. And there are different types of NDAs, for example, one-way, two-way or multilateral. That depends who gives the information and who is not allowed to use the information. What exactly are licenses? Yeah, that's actually a good way to allow third parties to exploit your IP. And in these contracts, there are some limits set. It's a bit comparable to rental. Those licenses can be exclusive. So that means the other person is the only one who is allowed to use this license. Or non-exclusive, then it means there are more third parties that are allowed to use it. Or cross-license, that means you're allowed to use one technology and the other one is allowed to use the other technology. It should also be made clear if sub-licenses are allowed. So that means the person who has the license, is he allowed to give the licenses to other people or not? What should be included in a contract for licenses? Yeah, the scope of the license for sure. And also how are improvements being handled? Who owns this IP? How long is it? Where is the third party allowed to use it, and how much does he have to pay for it? Here we've seen already that these IP provisions, they are normally in contracts. That's why we want to talk a bit about a contract now. What is a contract exactly? It's an agreement between at least two parties, but it depends on the national law exactly. It's legally binding. The parties, they have a legal right to enforce it actually. And in a contract, there are some clauses that are included. And here exactly, we want to talk about some IP contracts and IP clauses that should be included in these contracts. So what is typically included in a contract? Normally, for example, you start with a preamble. So that's the background of the relationship. Then you define the parties. You have some definitions in there. then it is made clear what is object and the obligations of the parties. There it should be handled the price and also how long this contract lasts, which law is used, so for example German law or law from the US, and is it also allowed to do subcontracting. So can some tasks be given to externals maybe, and there are lots of other clauses that should be included. It's also about data protection waivers or also force majeure, how to handle this. Now in detail we want to talk about IP contracts, what clauses should be included here, or when to have IP in mind. Here I just mentioned some aspects, when to have IP clauses in mind and when IP contracts should be done or can be done. So what kinds of IP contracts are there? For example, there can be assignment agreements, so that means there's a permanent transfer of ownership of IP. There you need a contract. Or also license agreements, those are also contracts, also non-disclosure agreements, or technology transfer agreements, and also R&D agreements. And there are much more, for example, franchise agreements, joint venture agreements, and so on. There you also have to include some IP clauses. So let's talk about some important aspects in an IP contract. I have an example of a collaboration contract, and there should be some things considered. First of all, you should sign a non-disclosure agreement. That should be a best practice. Then it should also be made clear who owns which patent or which technology, who owns the patent in which country. This can be different. Is everyone allowed to give licenses to others, or how are licenses handled? Those should be also included in some contract. And it should also be made clear who sells the product and where to sell the product. Yeah, and who owns this patent in which country. So let's talk about some risks in IP contracts. One could be, for example, that someone discloses the technology, for example by fault. Then it is really important that you have a non-disclosure agreement. A fault, and it should not have been disclosed to the public. Or maybe you can also sue your collaboration partner if necessary. If it's not clear who drafts which patent, it can be complicated because patents are normally disclosed only after 18 months. And so you need a contract that it's made clear that you had the right of this patent here. And it should also be made clear who owns the licenses, so that there are no demands of money from your collaboration partner which can lead to confusion or problems. So if you have signed an IP contract before, it helps you to save a lot of trouble and a lot of risks. In the end here I have a best practice checklist that should help you when to have IP in mind. This is especially for developers or maybe also researchers. Well, you should do a freedom to operate analysis before every project. Always contact your IP department before presenting a technology. Evaluate your IP during the development process, so this should be done continuously. Then also redo this freedom to operate analysis before going to market, and an IP contract should be signed before every development with external partners. I hope this helped you a bit get an overview of IP management and IP contracts here.